Hello, this is another one of my videos on Alistair Parker's short introduction to the Second World War, this one dealing with Anglo-American relations. It comes from his chapter 15, which is relatively short, so I'm making it as a single video rather than splitting it up into sections. In the summer of 1944, the Anglo-American partnership still remained superficially equal for the last time. More British soldiers were fighting against the Germans and Japanese than were Americans. The British RAF contributed as much as the USAAF in the struggle against Germany, and the Royal Navy played the larger part. The initial landings in Normandy comprised equal numbers of British and Americans. But by the time of the German defeat in May 1945, the situation was radically different. Already in early 1944, the British public had seen, with awe and sometimes with envy, the material wealth of the United States in the equipment of its troops and their much superior pay and comfort to the British. By 1945, even the self-dramatization of Field Marshal Montgomery couldn't disguise the shrinkage of his command to a small sector of the front against Germany. The successes of the British and Indian troops in Burma now belonged to a sideshow. The Royal Navy had come lately to the struggle against Japan, but its role was clearly subordinate, whilst that of the RAF was almost non-existent. The British people still felt themselves citizens of a victorious great power, however, the centre of an empire whose devotion to the King Emperor had been so clearly shown over the past 6 years. They also felt merit in their survival as the only undefeated country to have fought against Nazi Germany from the beginning, and were aware of the admiration felt by at least some other Western Europeans at the success of their democracy. The British military still dominated Allied affairs in several theatres: the Mediterranean, Africa, Greece, the Near East, India, Burma, and at the end of the war in much of France, Belgium, Denmark, Norway, and together with the Canadians, the Netherlands. They were poised to retake Malaya and Singapore and to receive the surrender of the Japanese in the Dutch East Indies and southern Indochina. At Potsdam, Attlee and Bevin had smoothly inherited the roles of Churchill and Eden as spokesman for one of the big three. Here is Clement Attlee, the new British Prime Minister, from July 1945 up through to October 51. And here is his Foreign Secretary, Ernest Bevin, from July 45 up to March 51. Yet, in 1945, most British citizens, together with many cabinet ministers, exaggerated the ability of Britain to remain as an independent world power. Past economic strengths had blinded them to the financial constraints which reflected their now lack of resources to be a superpower. By contrast, Keynes, who had devoted the last 2 years of his life to financial negotiation with the United States, saw that the British reflex actions were those of a rich man unaware that the financial problems of peacetime would soon be as difficult as those of the period of war. During the war, the American Lend-Lease system had compromised British independence, and its abrupt ending in September 1945 had left Britain insolvent. Already in November 1944, the American civil air transport companies wanted the deregulation of international air routes, whilst the British wanted a degree of market sharing, partly because of the wartime agreement that for the duration of the war, British aircraft production would be entirely military, leaving the Americans to develop transport aircraft. Responding, Roosevelt had stated that the American Congress would be less likely to meet British Lend-Lease needs if its members thought that the British were opposed to the agreement about air transport. It was a threat. As victory against Hitler seemed near, the Americans thought that the British would be an obstacle to the creation of the world of harmonious international cooperation that they wanted to see and secure peace, prosperity, and democracy. Rather, by being concerned, or still concerned, with spheres of influence and the balance of power, the British, they thought, threatened international cooperation and consensus. From the American standpoint, the British were also too preoccupied with the politics and economics of empire and unduly ready to collaborate with reactionary conservative forces, as in Greece. The Americans were also unsympathetic to Britain's imperial links, and to Churchill's anger supported the idea of international machinery for dealing with trusteeships and dependent territories. Vicious conflicts had emerged between them during 1944 and 45 over a series of issues: Argentina, Greece, Italy, and Palestine in particular. Both before and during meetings of the Big Three at Yalta and Potsdam, Roosevelt and later Truman distanced themselves from the British, declining to have a shared position towards the Soviet Union, lest it be seen as ganging up on the Russians. In February 1945, at Yalta, for example, Roosevelt had even supported Stalin's toast to the Soviets' execution of 50,000 German officers, an action which Churchill had found abhorrent. Roosevelt again threatened Lend-Lease via Congress when the British sought to conclude a long-term contract for Argentinian meat, a country in which it was felt American interests should now come first. The Americans publicly rebuked the British when they sought to veto the appointment of Count Carlo Sforza as Italian foreign minister on the grounds that he had left-wing connections. They also opposed the Greek intervention in the Greek Civil War against the communists, the British chiding under American lectures from their pulpit of moral superiority about the people's popular will. Then, after the German War, there was the issue of Palestine, surviving Jews from Europe seeking to find a new home there. As the mandatory power, the British were fearful of Arab reactions and refused to allow unrestricted immigration. This resulted in a Jewish terror campaign against the British in Palestine, followed by British repression and American outrage, a congressman from New York even voting against a post-war loan to Britain. During the war, the American Lend-Lease program had been a lifeline for Britain, but to everyone's surprise, Truman ordered its complete end only days after the Japanese surrender. This was catastrophic for the British economy. Before the Lend-Lease program had begun in March 41, paying for the war had already led to major problems for the British. Their foreign investments had had to be sold in order to pay for imported food and munitions from the United States. Huge debts to sterling area countries had piled up in order to cover military costs abroad and to finance imports from those countries. The volume of export production had gone down to 30% of its pre-war level in order to increase arms manufacture. British liabilities increased whilst its assets fell. Foreign earnings diminished whilst its overseas expenses rose. Even if there was a surge in exports at the end of the war and the end of wartime need for weapons, the British people would do better than they had done in the final years of the war. A deficit of about £1,000 million was expected in 1946. As Keynes told the Cabinet in August 1945, the Americans were the only possible source for the funds that Britain needed. The British might pose as equal partners with the United States and the Soviet Union, but they had to tell the Americans that they simply couldn't pay their bills. The British, for Keynes, faced two alternatives. First, drastically reduce overseas spending, withdraw British troops from abroad, give up overseas bases, leave Greece, and run down the occupation of the British zone in Germany, abandon the pretensions of being a great power. At the same time, imports would have to be restricted from those countries whose currency could be most easily secured, and total imports would have to be restricted by further weakening British standards of living. This option was what Keynes termed starvation corner. The alternative was to persuade the Americans to cover Britain's external deficit until British exports had grown sufficiently. Keynes himself led a team to Washington to attempt the second option. He was confident of two arguments, but the Americans only responded to the second. The first, which had little appeal to the Americans, was that the British merited thanks for being the only nation to have continually battled the Nazis for 2 years before the Americans entered the war, and they had contributed a proportionally greater effort than them in the defeat of Hitler. By contrast, the Americans saw their own actions as a chivalrous defense of a friend in danger, and that they had twice intervened decisively in European wars, for which they should be thanked. Keynes' second argument, which came to have considerable traction amongst knowledgeable Americans, was that a bankrupt Britain would inhibit the creation of the New World free for trade and investment desired by the Americans. A prosperous Britain would benefit the American capitalist economy and also advance peace and general prosperity, and so was worth paying for. This led to the grant of an American loan of $4,400 million, albeit with conditions, including a British promise to make current British earnings from foreign trade dollar convertible 1 year after the credit came into effect. Although the British reluctantly signed the agreement in December 1945, the loan only received approval from Congress in July 46, and with a clear sense that it was in American interests. Not only would it increase international trade and open British and other markets to American exporters, but as a growing number of advisors were coming to accept, the British Empire served as the major barrier to Soviet expansion across Eurasia. In this context, Winston Churchill's famous speech in March 46 about an Iron Curtain descending across Europe and his appeal for a special relationship between the British Commonwealth and Empire and the United States resonated with American policymakers, even though not yet with the general public. However, growing American fear of the Soviet Union transformed the former British Prime Minister into a revered prophet. Despite these tensions and mutual suspicions by many ordinary Americans and British, there were strong ties of friendship now at all levels of society. The two nations had experienced much together. They shared many common goals and ideals. Officials and military leaders had cooperated fruitfully during the war and afterwards, and most of the ordinary American troops billeted in Britain during the war had developed positive feelings towards their hosts. So many thanks to you for listening, and particular thanks to my patrons for their kind support and encouragement. Without them, I wouldn't be able to make these videos. You're very welcome to support my channel if you so wish. Do like, comment, and share on the videos. Subscribe if you want to be notified of future videos. I'll give Patreon and PayPal links below if you want to provide practical support. Next week, we'll talk about From Alliance to Cold War, the Soviet Union and the West. Have a good day.